So, Mike, we've got an episode today about open protocols. It's a theme that runs through today's Ctrl-Alt-Speech. So I thought I'd start today with a user prompt from Surf, which is an app from the creators of Flipboard, which uses the AT protocol. We'll talk more a bit about it in the intro, but the way that Surf gets you to engage on its app is to ask you to search the social web. So I want you to verbally search the social web.
Verbally search the social web, huh? Okay. Well, I will say that this has been a good week for the social web, as I discovered at South by Southwest with a bunch of conversations, including with the creator of Surf and also with the CEO of Blue Sky. So there's a lot going on in the social web, and we will talk about some of it in a moment. But what about you? If you were to search the social web, what would you be finding?
Well, I made the mistake of going into one of my social apps and looking at what things I'd searched for recently. Always a dangerous thing. And I found 0 Day, which is a Netflix series about cyber hacking, which I don't know if you have seen. Very good. I was looking for some reactions to it because I really enjoyed it. Stars Robert De Niro and quite prescient in terms of the US government situation. So I tried to kind of see what reactions there were to it.
I was going to say, I was wondering, you're searching for 0 Day, that usually for hacks. So I was wondering if you were turning into a bit of a hacker, Ben.
Yeah, no comment. Hello and welcome to the 50th episode of Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of the major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's March the 13th, 2025, and this week's episode is brought to you with financial support from the Future of Online Trust and Safety Fund and from our sponsor today, Resolver, the leading provider of risk intelligence and advisory services. This week, we're talking about a whole range of topics, including decentralized social media, user appeals, and a big new book that's dropped about Meta. My name is Ben Whitelaw, and I'm the founder and editor of Everything in Moderation. And I'm joined by a recently traveled Mike Masnick, who is just back from South by Southwest.
A not yet recovered Mike Masnick. South by Southwest is always absolutely exhausting. It is impossible to find time to sleep, as far as I can tell, in the few times I've been. And this was no exception.
I've not got a chance to go, Mike. Tell us a bit about what it's like and what your experience was this time around.
It's hard to describe. There's a ton of people, a ton of things going on all at once. Austin, the city, gets completely overwhelmed. There will be very, very long lines for barbecue, but it is worth it because the barbecue is always excellent. There's always a lot of really smart people around, a lot of wonderful people to talk to. It's impossible to get anywhere in any amount of reasonable time. You'll miss half the things that you think you want to go see. But yeah, it's a time.
Yeah, it's just like all good conferences. You don't see enough. You eat too much.
Yeah. No, it's pretty intense. But, the really good thing about South by is that there are always a ton of really good and really smart people. And you can be walking down the street. And as happened to me on Monday morning, I was walking down the street and not paying attention. And all of a sudden, Cory Doctorow grabs me. And it's just like, Mike. So you have moments like that.
Nice.
Which was fun.
Nice.
But yeah, there's a ton of smart people. I had so many great conversations. I met a bunch of really smart people, got to hang out with a bunch of old friends I hadn't seen in a while, and a lot of catching up, a lot of talking, a lot of good idea sharing. Really, it's always sort of mind stimulating.
Yeah, and you managed to squeeze in an interview with the CEO of Blue Sky, Jay Graber. Ding, ding, ding.
Mike, ding, ding, ding.
Mike's on the board of Blue Sky. We must declare. Yeah, I don't know if you declared that in the interview. I don't know if it was just in the version I saw.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have an opportunity. I don't know if the intro, the CEO of South by did the intro. I don't even remember if they said that or not. It's a good point. But yeah, I mean, Jay was the main attraction. My role was just to throw some questions at her.
Yeah.
But it was a fun interview. It was on the main stage. It seemed to be really popular. Apparently there was a really long line to get in. We got a lot of really good feedback from it. People were really interested in what she had to say. The video of it is online on YouTube. If folks want to see it. I think it was a really detailed exploration of Blue Sky, what it is trying to do and why it's different than other social apps out there.
Yeah, she does a really good job of kind of unpacking some of the particularly moderation features that users can use to kind of customize their experience. She uses the phrase kind of choose your own adventure, which I think is a nice summation of how the direction in which platforms are moving, I would say, and obviously what makes Blue Sky really interesting. And she has a great T-shirt on, which attracted a lot of attention.
That was the news story, yeah. That was the one that broke the news.
Yeah, for those who didn't see, she was wearing a T-shirt that looked very similar to one that Mark Zuckerberg had worn before, but hers said, "A world without Caesars."
In Latin.
In Latin.
Right, because the original, it was Mark Zuckerberg apparently designed his own T-shirt. It wasn't just that he wore his T-shirt. And his T-shirt was a play on a Caesar statement, also in Latin, which the original was basically, effectively, it's Caesar or no one. Basically, I am your king. And so Zuck's was, it's Zuck or no one in Latin, which is also, again, sort of saying Zuckerberg saying, I am your king. And so, yes, Jay's T-shirt looked exactly the same, had Latin phrasing in the same font, except saying a world without Caesars. It's fairly clever.
Very clever, very clever. Nice to be saying something without saying something at all.
Yes. I think one of the media outlets said something along the lines of it was shitposting on stage without saying anything. There's now tremendous demand for that T-shirt, and I believe that Blue Sky is planning to sell the T-shirt. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, I'll get my order in. One question I had around, one of the things she said was about the kind of billionaire proof element of Blue Sky and how the nature of it running on the protocol means that it's less likely to be bought by a billionaire. I've seen a kind of bit of discussion about that afterwards. From your point of view, do you really think that a site like Blue Sky is exempt from being taken over by an Elon Musk type figure?
Yeah, it was a good question. I mean, I have been using the term billionaire resistant rather than billionaire proof.
Yeah, okay.
And I will stand by that. So, the argument is that, as Jay made clear, the nature of everything being open and replicable, and people are trying right now to replicate all different aspects of the Blue Sky AT protocol stack. We're seeing more and more of that happen every day, and there's more coming. And the company's extremely excited about that. Unlike most companies where it's like other people trying to copy what you're doing and take your users and all that, Blue Sky is very, very supportive of that. But part of that is what I've referred to also as like the technological poison pill. Which is that if Blue Sky, the company, does anything bad, and again, ding, 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 just repeating, I'm on the board. But if they do anything bad or horrible, if I turn out to be a horrible board member and direct them to, not that I have the full power to do that, but, tell them do these bad, horrible things that will be bad for your users, it is set up so that users can exit. Other people can build everything. You can bring your users, you can bring your content, and Blue Sky will have no control over it. Therefore, that gives the company itself incentive not to do those bad, awful things. I think the example Jay used was inserting ads between every post. But that also makes it less attractive for a billionaire to come in and take it over. Because if they do, then that same thing happens, right? So if an Elon comes in and takes it over, rather than everybody having to go reform somewhere else, you can just very quickly move to a different platform and bring all your content with you and bring all your followers with you, which we couldn't do when Elon took over Twitter. Yeah. So it's resistant, but I mean, there's always a risk that a billionaire could do something bad, or that the company itself could do something bad. But it's designed to make that less likely, to align the incentives better with the users.
Yeah, I would say that Jay is a very good speaker on these topics. She does a great job of kind of explaining Blue Sky for those who maybe aren't as clear on what it is and what it's built on. And also I came away from it just being pretty hopeful about the future of social media generally, which is something that hasn't happened for a while, Mike. So congratulations to you and Jay for inspiring a bit of hope at this time. A couple of things to mention, a few bits of admin. We've got a couple of projects that we're working on outside of Ctrl-Alt-Speech that are worth mentioning. You've got a new podcast. You mentioned it a couple of weeks back about Section 230. I've got some bad news. You were referred to as a veteran journalist in the promotion of this podcast. Yeah. And then I just wanted to flag it to you. I think it's unfair.
Yeah.
Experience maybe, but veteran,
man. Take me out back and shoot me. This is... This is bad. But yeah, the new podcast series, it's a limited series. I forget. I honestly forget how many episodes it is. It's either 6 or 7, I think.
Mhm.
It's called Otherwise Objectionable, available wherever you get podcasts. But the first episode is out now. And it's a documentary style podcast. It's not this nonsense, Ben, where where I just chat randomly. I'm really impressed with the production team and kind of what they've done. There are amazing interviews in there. In the first episode, we have Jeff Kossoff and Eric Goldman and Jessica Malugin and a bunch of other sort of tech policy experts. Coming up soon, we have both of the co-authors of Section 230. We have the lawyers who were involved in a bunch of the early cases. It's a really, really fun podcast. I'm very excited and happy that it's out in the world.
Nice. I've heard rumors that it's going to be as big as Serial. That's just what I'm hearing on the podcast grapevine.
Somebody was telling me that we need to add a murder somewhere in it.
I mean, some will claim that that's what is about to happen to Section 230.
Yeah, seriously. True.
And from my side, you might have heard that I did an event with a couple of great newsletter creators in January, an event we called Marked as Urgent. And we're doing another one of those in London at the end of March, or in a couple of weeks' time. If folks are in London around that time and there's a big trust and safety conference going on, do come along. We'll include details in the show notes and also in tomorrow's Everything in Moderation newsletter as well that will go out. And then, basically, we'll run into today's stories. At the end of today, we've got a great bonus chat with a great company called Resolver. Many Ctrl-Alt-Speech listeners will know that next week is the annual Game Developers Conference. And there's a lot of interest in player safety at the conference, as you'd expect. We're going to talk to Carly Chadwick, who's the head of platform trust and safety delivery, about some of the trends that she's seeing in the gaming space at the moment. If you listen in, you'll see me gently but firmly being put in my place about a couple of things, which is worth listening to. Okay, so
I don't put you in your place enough? Is that what I'm hearing?
It wasn't a request, Mike. It wasn't a request. Obviously, I wasn't here last week, Mike, but I did listen into the podcast, and you talked a lot about the risk that the current US administration poses from an internet safety perspective. That's where we're going to start today's summary of stories. And you're going to take us through a piece that has been published on The Verge about the Takedown Act and some of the threats that poses.
Yeah, so the Takedown Act it's this bill. It came out last year. It almost got pushed into the final, must-pass funding bill at the end of last year, and then at the very end, it was stripped out of it. It is one of these laws, like many of the internet regulation laws, that on its face, if you just sort of read what it's about, you're like, yeah, that makes sense. We should absolutely do that. And then when you get into the details, you realize, oh, wait, no, this would be really bad. We shouldn't do that. And so it's one of those complicated things. The issue that it is about is what is commonly referred to within the space as NCII, or non-consensual intimate imagery, the thing that used to be referred to as revenge porn before people realized that's a horrible name for it. But it's, generally intimate imagery of someone who does not want that shared. That is a real problem, and it has been a real problem on the internet for a very long time. That kind of content is often weaponized, and it is often creates real problems for people. And we've talked about it a bunch.
2 weeks ago, Breeze Lou, the profile in Wired. Yeah,
exactly.
Really tough stuff, yeah.
Exactly. And so even at the end of that story, I think we had mentioned that she was pushing for the Takedown Act because she wanted legal support for this. What's happened in the last few weeks, which has made the law get a lot more attention, is one, that it passed the Senate through unanimous consent, which means they didn't even have a vote. Somebody just mentioned, like, is anyone going to protest this? And none of the senators stood up to protest for it. So it is past the Senate and is in the House. Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, who has basically control over what will move, has said that he is interested in moving this bill. So it sounds like that is likely. The First Lady, Melania Trump, has been promoting the bill as well. And then in the State of the Union, or the joint address to Congress last week, or I don't, was it last week? Time makes no sense anymore. I think it was last week. Donald Trump also promoted it as one of the things that he was pushing for, though, as he is known to do, he says the thing that he's supposed to say on the teleprompter, and then he goes a little bit off script. So in this case, he talked about it, and then he went off script immediately and said that he intended to use this law to take down content because nobody has had a more unfair experience online. Nobody in the world, Ben, has been treated more unfairly online than Donald Trump.
I agree.
Yeah, well, anyways, I wrote something about that where I was looking at it and saying, like, well, here we have the president of the United States admitting outright that he plans to abuse this law to take down content that he feels is unfair to him. That
Mhm.
should be a sign that the law is not properly written in a way that avoids abuse. And that is the major problem. And that is the point that is raised in this really wonderful piece in The Verge by Addie Robertson, saying that the Takedown Act isn't a law, it's a weapon. It is a weaponized bill that can be easily used, be easily abused by any particular government, by people who want to take content offline. It doesn't have safeguards built into it. There are similar laws. I mean, the most striking similarity that a lot of people refer to is things like the DMCA in the US copyright context, where if you find infringing content on a website, you can notify that website, and it's the notice and takedown process where the site, if they remove the content upon receiving a notice, they receive immunity or a safe harbor. So you can't be sued for infringement if you remove it upon notice. It's more involved than that because the DMCA also has a counter notice option where whoever uploaded the original content, if they are noticed and their content is removed, they can counter notice it. The site can put that content back up. And if the copyright holder still feels that it's a problem, they then have, I think it's 10 days, I forget now, to file a lawsuit. And the platform remains in a safe harbor. So they're protected as long as they follow that notice and takedown and counter notice process. There is also a provision in the DMCA, which is very poorly written and rarely effective, which effectively tries to limit fake notices on non-infringing material that is written so poorly that it can almost never be used in an effective way. There are a few cases like really on the margins, but mostly it is ineffective. And we've seen it. We've seen that it has been abused. There have been multiple studies on the DMCA and how that DMCA is used to take down content that is not infringing. Various reports, depending on different platforms, have said that somewhere in the range of 50 to 60% of notices, DMCA notices, are false notices for
Wow.
non-infringing content,
Okay.
which should be that seems like a problem, and that is already concerning. Now we move to the Take It Down Act, which is a similar sort of thing, but for NCII. It has none of those already problematic and weak safeguards in the DMCA. There's no counter notice set up. There's no punishment for sending false notices. And so therefore, it is designed in a manner that is very much set up for people to use it to abusively take content down. And then the enforcement side of it, in many ways, is left up to the FTC. And we right now have an incredibly biased FTC, an FTC that has made it clear that it wants to use the powers of the FTC to punish certain companies almost entirely on an ideological partisan basis. It has, opened an investigation, and it is pretty clear that it is not going to do anything to punish X. It's unclear if it will punish Meta. It might depend on how nice Mark Zuckerberg is to the administration, but it might go after other sort of enemies of the Trump administration. So why in the world would anyone support this bill right now? I mean, I understand why the sort of MAGA world will, because it is a weapon that they plan to weaponize. But the bill is co-sponsored by a Democrat, and you have a whole bunch of Democrats who are supporting it because they are reading the summary of the bill and the title of the bill, and they think it's a good bill. And so, I'm happy that The Verge had this article sort of laying out just really how problematic the bill is. And I still think the fact that Donald Trump himself made it clear that he, I don't think he even understood the bill, but that his first reaction to seeing what the bill was supposed to do is to talk about how he was going to use it to take down criticism of himself, which should set off alarm bells. And so I don't understand why anyone has been supporting this bill, but there's a very good chance that this bill will become law in the very near future, and then it will likely be widely abused.
And what does that abuse kind of look like, do you think, Mike? What are the potential implications of that across platforms that are governed by it?
I think there's two elements to be aware of. I mean, there's more, but within the time we have, let's do two.
Yeah.
So the first is just the ability of anyone to force any kind of content down, because you can make these bogus claims, and because the risk of failing to take down content when you receive a notice is so high. Platforms will be very quick to take down content. And again, like I said, with the DMCA, we've seen that somewhere 50 to 60% of DMCA notices are probably bogus. What we've learned is that there's lots of content. I mean, everybody listening to this podcast knows this. There's lots of content online that someone doesn't like. And historically, there was no real mechanism you could complain. But the only legal mechanism to remove any kind of content, especially in the US, was copyright law.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, anytime anyone didn't like any content, they would immediately jump to making a copyright claim because it's just a legal process.
Even if it didn't involve copyright.
Yes. And often it had nothing to do with copyright. And even like people would use it for legitimately bad content. I mean, I remember there were a bunch of stories about like people seeing anti-vax content, which is dangerous, problematic content, but people would file copyright claims on it to try and take it down. But then also there was lots of stuff. Like we've had DMCA notices filed against our articles, a bunch. There was this guy, Craig Britton, who for years he ran one of the first NCII related sites that people would send in intimate imagery of former partners or whoever, and he would post it to his website. He got sued and the FTC cracked down on him, and we wrote about all that. And he used a DMCA claim to try and take down our article. He also used a DMCA claim to try and take down the FTC settlement page against him. But that's what happens when you have a tool that allows people to take content down. They're going to use it. It's a legal tool. It looks scary. Companies don't want to take the risk and liability. They'll often just take that content down. Now, giving them a tool that's even stronger than the DMCA, it's clear that a lot of abuse is going to happen. So that's one side of the abuse. The second is what I was describing with the FTC. If you have a weaponized FTC that can enforce this law, then they get to pick and choose who they're going to enforce it against. And what has been made clear in this administration is that every enforcement action is only going against ideological enemies, not any sort of legitimate purpose. And therefore, it will definitely be weaponized by this administration to go after perceived enemies all over the place. They'll just say that they wouldn't take stuff down.
And what's the likelihood that it doesn't make it through the House? I mean, is there something done to educate representatives about what could happen if it passes?
I have no idea. I mean, definitely civil society has been speaking out about it. The Center for Democracy and Technology raised the alarms last year. They've been the loudest on it and the most thorough, and they're great. They know what they're talking about, and they've been making an effort. EFF has recently picked up on it as well and has been talking about it. Others have as well. But it's a concern. The Republicans hold the House. It's a very, very narrow margin. The last bill that got a lot of attention like this was obviously COSA, and eventually enough Republicans realized that that could be used for censorship that they sort of bailed on it. That was before they knew that they had the trifecta of, holding the House, the Senate, and the administration, which now they do. So maybe they don't mind weaponizing it, a lot of them. I don't know if they have the votes. The real trick is like making sure that none of the Democrats will vote for it. And I assume that there is some effort going on the Hill. I'm not privy to that kind of stuff, but I would hope that Democrats can be taught that this is a bill that will be weaponized by the Trump administration. Obviously, right now, there's bigger issues with sort of the funding and the government that may shut down, even though I still find it funny that the media is still reporting on the budget and the funding bills when we have Elon Musk shutting down the government no matter what happens with Congress. But that's an aside. That was last week's discussion.
The same end via different means.
Yeah. So I don't know that it's immediate because right now they're focused on that, but in theory that could be solved today or tomorrow, and then they could try and get back to business. And I wish that more Democrats realize that it is not business as usual. And a bill like this is not, it's not what it says on the tin, and it is very problematic in all sorts of ways. And giving the administration more power to punish websites for things they don't like is not something that anyone should be doing right now.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. That's a really, really helpful overview. I'm sure we will come back to this on future episodes of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. I'm going to move us on now to a story that has been very loudly talked about on a bunch of different news networks this week. I think the Takedown stuff has been kind of probably bubbling under the surface a little bit and likely to erupt. But this next story is one that has attracted a lot of attention for reasons we'll kind of discuss. This is a new book that's come out about Facebook. If you remember a few years ago now, it was The Whistleblowing of Frances Haugen. This is a big book serialization that's come out this week by a woman called Sarah Wynne Williams, and the book is called Careless People. Now, I might have a lot of book guilt already. There's a lot of books I buy and never get around to reading. I'm going to try and avoid this being one. It's attracted a lot of attention this week. She's given an interview to NBC News in which she explains what's in the book. And I'll talk a bit about who she is and what she says. She worked at Facebook from 2011 to 2017 as Director of Global Public Policy and worked within essentially kind of Joel Kaplan's team Joel Kaplan is the new Nick Clegg, for those who, and I will forever refer to him as that.
Yes.
He's a new Nick Clegg, so he is the chief global public policy head, so whatever grandiose title he has now. And she worked within his team, working on public policy in primarily Asia and Latin America. Got a lot of exposure to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and other members of the Facebook team. And her book, her memoir, is essentially the latest insight into the kind of machinations of Facebook as a company that controls large swathes of the globe's speech and access to the internet, frankly. She says a number of things in it which have been variously reported on. She alleges sexual harassment against Kaplan, which Facebook say he was cleared of back in 2017. She goes into more detail about an SEC filing that she submitted last year about Facebook misleading investors. She talks a bit about how Zuckerberg was interested in moving into China, some of which has been reported before. And she also talks a bit about the culture of the company, and she says various things about how Sandberg asked her to take flights during her pregnancy, even when she wasn't very sure about flying. And so you get a sense of what Facebook was like primarily in that period between 2011 and 2017. Obviously a long time ago now. But there's been a fascinating reaction to the book. The book came out on Tuesday in the US. It actually came out today in the UK. So I've got it on order. It's one of those things, Mike, that says a lot about the company and the platform. And we try not to talk too much about specifics in companies. They change a lot of the time. But I think it's still worth discussing. There's also been a bit of an update this week that made you feel like it was also worthy of a story in today's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.
Yeah. I mean, the book sounds interesting, but I'm always a little skeptical of any of these sort of like tell-alls from the insiders. It often feels like they have an axe to grind. And a mix of the stories that have come out that are in the book, I haven't read it yet either. I'm going to get it out of the library at some point. But some of the stuff has been reported before, and it's sort of reported here again in sort of incendiary language. I've seen a number of former Facebook Meta employees on social media who have been reporting that the incidents that are reported in the book that they were a part of were not reported fairly or accurately.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some concern about that. But the thing that really caught my attention, though, it's worth reading these books and getting the perspective, but recognizing that it's from a single person's perspective and maybe not putting full weight into it. But the thing that really caught my attention this week was the fact that Meta basically tried to stop the publication of the book. This only came out yesterday, really, where they apparently, as part of her exit agreements, there was a severance agreement that included a non-disparagement clause.
Right.
And Meta is alleging that she violated the non-disparagement clause in this. And so as a sign of Mark Zuckerberg's new commitment to free speech, they tried to enforce this against her and went to an arbitration setup, basically making a claim against both the author, Sarah Wynne Williams, and the publisher, which is an imprint of Macmillan. The arbitrator came out yesterday with a ruling noting two things. One, Macmillan, the publisher, did not sign the severance agreement with Meta and therefore is not bound by it. And therefore, the arbitrator has no jurisdiction over the publisher at all. So they're sort of out of the story. But they did say that the publisher was the one who showed up. Sarah herself did not show up. And so they sent notices to her and told her again that she had to reply by today, this morning, Thursday morning, 2 days after the book came out in the US, I'll note. And she had ignored it. But over the weekend, as part of her promotional efforts for the book, she had gone on a podcast, a popular podcast is the description, and talked about how they were trying to shut her down and silence her by talking about the arbitration claim.
Right.
So the arbitrator was like, okay, well, now she clearly knows about it. And so one, in general, it's probably not a good idea to completely ignore an arbitration move against you on a contract. She may be in violation of the contract. But the bigger thing is like Meta making this effort in the first place, right?
Right.
Like there is this term, which I am associated with, called the Streisand effect.
I was going to bring it up. It's a perfect example, no?
Yeah. And the whole idea is like, it's based on this idea that if you go legal to try and silence someone, it is only going to generate way more attention for that work. And like, I was less interested in reading the book until I saw that Meta was trying to silence it. Yeah. And that's why I'm going to reserve it at the library, because I would now like to read this book even as I'm a little skeptical of some of the writing, but doing this it seems so counterproductive. Like, just let it play out, respond. Like, they responded by saying like, this is old news and misleading, and just it'll disappear in 2 weeks. People are going to forget about it. But doing this makes it look like, oh, wait, there's something serious in this book that you're trying to silence, Mr. Free Speech, returning to our free speech roots.
Oh, it's delicious irony, isn't it? That, the platform who are claiming they're returning to having more speech and fewer mistakes, shutting down a publisher
Yes.
who they don't have an agreement with. It's textbook stuff.
Yeah. So the arbitration agreement, the arbitrator did come out with this thing saying, because she indicated that she was aware of the arbitration effort, that she is now banned from promoting the book and, to the extent possible, distributing or selling the book. But that's the publisher. That's not her. But she's not supposed to promote it. I don't see how that flies. I mean, it depends on the actual nature of the severance agreement and the non-disparagement clause in there. I think basically at this point she's being punished because she didn't show up for the arbitration hearing. And so we'll see what happens there. But either way, none of that, it doesn't really help Meta. Even if they technically win this arbitration and maybe she'll like have to pay up some money or something, it's just going to draw that much more attention to the book.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a very large company trying to silence a memoir.
It's a terrible look.
Yeah, or whatever clause is in whatever contract. It doesn't look great, but...
And I'll have to... The details here may matter a lot, but there have been efforts, especially in the last few years, in part because of the Me Too movement, to pass these laws that basically say non-disparagement clauses around sexual harassment are not enforceable. And so there may be some elements of that in there because, again, she did make accusations around sexual harassment in some form or another. So that kind of stuff might be exempted because of various laws. But again, I think most of those are kind of state laws. And so I'm not sure where she's located or which state laws apply for this.
Yeah, we'll move on to other stories, but it is worth noting, at least I'm very cynical of the 3, 4, 5 people who suddenly come out of the woodwork to kind of push back against one person's version of events. It's very straightforward. We both work in the media, Mike. We know how straightforward it is for a company to call upon some of its many thousands of employees to push back against a version of events. So again, I'm trying to kind of keep an open mind at this stage.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's not fair to say that. And I'm not saying that the book is inaccurate or not. No. I am saying that like there are people I know who I trust and who weren't like out there. I've spoken to a few people who are former Meta employees and certainly not Meta boosters, by any stretch of the imagination, and they were sort of skeptical of the book as well. So I have some skepticism about some of the stories of the book. I think it's one person's view, which is always interesting, but we should remember that it's one person's view.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Interesting stuff. I'm sure there'll be plenty more media coverage this week. One
more quick point on this, because I actually do think it's important. One of the big stories that has come out about this is the story about the stuff in China. And I did want to I meant to raise it earlier, but now I'm thinking about we should definitely include it. One of the things that like Kat and I talked about last week, as an example, and this was before all the controversy with this book, was like the example of Facebook and Vietnam and what sort of compromises are they willing to put in. And the discussion that Kat had, which I think was really important to think about, was that there is a nuanced discussion to be had about if we're trying to get into a country that doesn't have that much freedom of speech, do we make certain compromises to enable at least some kinds of online speech? Is nothing better or worse than some, but more limited amounts of speech. And so I think a lot of the China story could be seen in that light. It sounds like internal discussions about what are we okay with? What is Facebook okay with to try and get into China? China is obviously a very large market. It is presented in the book and in the media reporting on the book as if it is a very clear case of like, oh, Facebook compromising with its principles, which might be true. It may absolutely be true, but there is another possible reading of it that is Facebook considering internally, like how far are we willing to go to try and get some openness, some ability for people in China to use Facebook to speak? Is that better than none at all? And the fact that, no compromise, no final setup was ever done suggests that these are internal brainstorming things. That does happen. And people can have a nuanced discussion about that. What trade-offs are we willing to do that is non-evil? But that doesn't, it could be that I certainly wouldn't put it past Mark Zuckerberg to be terrible and evil and say that like, no, we're just going to screw over users and allow the Chinese government to spy on everyone. But I don't know.
Or whether they had the right people in the room or the right information available.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's the other thing, because Wynne Williams is a New Zealander. She's a former diplomat. I'm sure she has a bunch of great skills. Is she qualified to make decisions about the way in which Meta kind of moves into parts of Latin America or Asia? Probably not, probably not. And this is goes back to the kind of culture point about how big companies based in the West Coast of the US, make decisions for the rest of the world. And I think that's it's a thread that's been running for the last 15 years, essentially, and keeps coming up. But this is the latest one of those. Cool. We've got probably time for like a few different stories, Mike, maybe 3 smaller stories to run through.
Let's try and go quick.
Yeah. Famous last words. Lead us off with the story about the Reddit rules check. We both had this on our list, so I'm kind of excited about this one.
Yeah, this is really cool. So Reddit has launched this new feature, which is as you're posting content, you can do a rule check before, which is basically, I assume, AI driven. Before you post something, you can have it check to see if the AI thinks you violated the rules, rather than punish first, where you post something, then you get yelled at, or this content was taken down, and you get all mad. It just sort of gives you a feedback and says like, hey, this violates the rules. We probably aren't going to allow you to post it, and therefore you can adjust. I'd be interested to see how this works in practice, right? This could be used for gaming, where you sort of like figure out how can I walk right up to the line without getting in trouble and all sorts of stuff. But as like a feedback tool, and as sort of like trying to train the user into like not violating our rules, I think this is great. I think it's really amazing. And I'll be interested to see if other sites start to pick up on it, because it seems like a really good concept and like a technical approach to teaching users about what the rules and what the limits of the rules are. So I think this is a really cool experiment. I'd love to see how it works out with Reddit. I could see areas where it will fail, but I'd love to see how it goes. And I'd love to see other sites trying something similar as well.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of jumped ahead here. We talked about AI being used for moderation, almost moderator level, being used to kind of enforce policies. But actually, we've kind of almost seems jumped that a little bit. And Reddit, which have a strong history of creating moderated tools and doing user engagement, have kind of gone one step further here, which is really exciting.
It's very cool. It's very cool.
Really like it. The story that I picked out this week, Mike, is a story about the online dispute settlement bodies. We talked about this in the podcast in the past. It's a DSA specific provision where users can now apply to have their content reviewed by a very specific online dispute settlement body, and they will work with the platforms to figure out whether the right rules were followed. And you can kind of essentially complain if you feel like your content was taken down unnecessarily, or if you reported it, nothing was done. And ACE is Appeal Center Europe, is one of the 5 or 6 ODS bodies that have started kind of reviewing content on different platforms. ACE works specifically with Facebook, YouTube, and also TikTok. And it's released some data, just a small data set about some of the initial cases it's reviewed. What it said in a blog post, which we'll link to in the show notes, is that it's had 1,500 people submit appeals against their content in the last 3 months, I think since the start of the year. And so far, it has gone through 150-ish appeals specifically related to Facebook. Every platform needs a different data agreement, and at the moment it only has an agreement with Facebook. It's going to start to look at appeals from TikTok and YouTube shortly. And of those 150, about half of them apparently have been ruled against the original decision made by Facebook. So the ODS body has kind of pushed back against the original decision to either leave the content up or to pull it down. And that's interesting because, that suggests that there's a kind of high proportion of decisions made by platforms that aren't according to policy. Whether or not this stuff scales, we don't know. We're at a very early stage of this, but I think it's really interesting to see some of this data come out at an early stage. And looking forward to seeing more of this and also more data from the other ODS bodies as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's cool. I'm glad that we're getting the data. As a reminder, like the rulings of these bodies are not binding, so we'll also have to see whether or not the platforms actually listen to them. But it's interesting to see. The other thing that I think is interesting is 1,500 complaints. I'm sort of trying to do the math and like, does that build up to a real business? Because, part of the idea here is that ACE has to be self-sustaining and all the other ones, and so I'm not sure that's enough.
No, so, it's a big question about what the throughput is of these appeals. Like, can the platforms promote them enough? Will they promote them enough to its users? And then will you have enough ODS bodies to kind of process them? And then we don't know.
Yeah, and then the speed with which they process them. So, 1,500 complaints in, they've done 141 decisions, less than 10%. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see the sort of all of this, how quickly they can do it, how many complaints are coming in, how closely related. But we're starting to see data, and that's fascinating.
Yeah. One platform that's not bound by an ODS body or isn't covered by an ODS body as yet, I believe, is Spotify. And they're the subject of the third small story that we've got today, Mike.
Yeah, this was an interesting story. There have been some sort of interesting trust and safety questions around Spotify and sort of what content is allowed on there around like podcasts and stuff. But this one came out. There was Andrew Tate, who is just a horrible person. If you don't know who he is, like consider yourself lucky.
Don't Google it.
Yeah,
No.
I'll leave it at that. He's a terrible person. But he's sort of apparently set up a class on Spotify, and it was just as awful as an awful person would create. And the interesting thing here, I think, was that Spotify employees kind of revolted on this one. And so there was sort of an internal Slack channel where people were calling out how terrible it was that Spotify was allowing Andrew Tate and his class to be on the platform. And so it's sort of an interesting statement on seeing employees within a company standing up and saying like, hey, no, we don't want this on our platform. We're not comfortable working for this company that would enable this sort of awful content.
Yeah, we saw that back in January as well when Mark Zuckerberg made his announcement. We saw a lot of Meta employees revolt internally on Slack and to an extent publicly as well. But this is an example of actually having some effect, and that content was taken down. So it's a reminder to trust and safety professionals, even though you potentially feel like you don't have a voice, these things can change. Let's round up our stories this week, Mike, with a tiny story that BBC published this week about an interview with Roblox's CEO. We don't have loads of time to go into it, but it basically is a sit down with Dave Baszucki, I think is how you pronounce it. And he talks about their approach to safety online and to child safety. Roblox is obviously used by millions of children online, often gets criticized for its approach to AI safety in particular. And what's interesting here is that he basically says that if parents don't think Roblox is safe, then they shouldn't be allowing their children to use it. And I thought that was just a really interesting reaction to this question of child safety. It's something we come back to a lot. And I appreciated the honesty and the originality of the response, basically to say, if you aren't sure as a parent that your child is safe, then better to be on the side of safety, to cede onto one side, because you have to be sure yourself. So I thought that was an interesting line from that interview.
Yeah, and I think some people are reacting negatively to this, kind of saying like, oh, well, he's not taking responsibility. But no, I mean, he's right to some extent, right? Like the parents are the sort of first defense for children's use of technology and devices and services. And so saying like, look, the parents have a role here is, I think, an important statement. And I'm glad that he was willing to do it, because I think a lot of tech CEOs, because they're being yelled at so much, they sort of internalize the idea that the entirety of the responsibility has to be on them. But it can never be, right? I mean, responsibility has to be spread around to a number of people. For him to say like, okay, look, if you don't trust me, don't use it, I think is a really honest statement. And I think it's a good one to hear.
Yeah. I don't know if Baszucki or anybody from Roblox is going to be at the GDC conference next week in San Francisco, but it's a neat segue into our bonus chat for those who haven't been to the conference. And I'm yet to make my debut, but it's a huge conference with some of the biggest games developers where they're talking about innovation, creativity, and player safety. We talked about this with Carly Chadwick, the head of platform trust and safety delivery at Resolver, which provides a range of risk intelligence and advisory services. And Resolver's actually been around even before Facebook, Mike. They're that old.
Wow. Okay. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So, we get into that with Carly, and I hope listeners enjoy our bonus chat this week. Great to have you join us on Ctrl-Alt-Speech, Carly. Thanks very much for making the time. Before we get into the kind of gaming questions, for those who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about Resolver and what it does.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, Ben. So Resolver Trust and Safety has been going strong for about 20 years now, actually. We're coming up to our 20th anniversary, which is really exciting. But we started in 2005 under a slightly different name, actually. We were known as CRISP back in the day, and we were really set up with our mission around keeping children safe online. That started with our founder, Adam Hildreth, who, whilst working in a different venture, had very quickly identified, unfortunately, how at risk children were from grooming and other predatory behaviour online. Thus, this CRISP dream came to life. So, like I said, it's been 20 years. We've been combating online abuse ever since. That central aim still really being about keeping children safe when they are online. But that has since expanded out. So today we work with social media companies, search engines, NGO partners, regulators, just to name a few, to deliver on that mission. Our expertise has stretched a lot more wider than just child safety now. So we are core online harm specialists in everything from that original child safety goal right through to hate speech, counter-terrorism, suicide, self-harm. And we're doing all of that from our original base here in Leeds, which is where I'm speaking to you from now, and all of our other global offices through that network of online technical intelligence and our threat analyst teams.
Brilliant. And so talk a little bit about what those threat analyst teams do then. What role do they play and what information are they providing to the platforms and services you work with?
Yeah, good question. One of my favorite things about Resolver is our diversity. And I think this has never been more apparent than with those threat analyst teams, so our human intelligence. We have them working 24/7, and they're covering all manner of languages, global markets, risk spaces. And those people have got some of the most interesting backgrounds I've ever seen. We've got ex-military, ex-law enforcement, sociologists. We've got people who have come from academia, so people who've studied psychology, linguistics, criminology, you name it. And they're all coming together to combine that knowledge that they've got with our technical expertise to find all of those online harms that I just mentioned. And I think going back to that 24/7 aspect, risk is global. We all know that within the industry. But I think what's really important and what's special about those threat analysts is recognizing that risk is also localized. Now, what may manifest as a risk on one platform in, say, the German-speaking market, it's not necessarily going to be the case in the Korean-speaking market. We can't rely on our understanding of hate speech in North America to be able to tackle the risk of hate speech in France. We really need a localized understanding of what is that nuance in that region to be able to really and most effectively proactively monitor what those risks are, not just for the users who are in those spaces, but for those platforms and those companies as well. So they are really well placed to do that. They're employing all of those great skills, that behavioral analysis, that OSINT, geolocating, just to name a few of their skill set, to find what is happening in that region, what's happening today, what might be happening tomorrow to best protect people. And that could be anything from what's the trajectory of neo-Nazi radicalization in Spain? How is this latest technology feature going to be used to share CSAM? Or how are bad actor communities going to exploit an upcoming major event, say an election? What's going to happen globally to impact those spaces?
Interesting. And we were talking before we started, you're a German speaker yourself, you started as an analyst. And what are the kind of major events that you've worked on in the past really spring to mind when you think about the threat analysis and threat detection space that you've worked within?
That's a really good question. And I think, unfortunately, in the field that we're in, there's been quite a few events over recent years that come to mind. COVID being one of them, the US election, the most recent, and the one prior to that. For me, as a threat analyst, my very first incident, let's call it, which really brought to my mind how fast-paced this industry is, was unfortunately Christchurch. I say it in interviews when we recruit people. The very best thing about the world of trust and safety is that every day is different. You don't know what's going to happen next month, next year. The risk is ever evolving. And that was never more so the case for me than the morning of Christchurch. And I remember coming into the office, as we all do, with my internal to-do list. I'm going to finish that project. I'm going to go make a start researching this. And walked into an office that was alive with activity in a way that I'd never seen before. We had people literally running from desk to desk, trying to make sense of what was going on. And it was horrific. From a linguistic standpoint, which is my background, it brought to light that exploitation element of what are people going to do, or what tactics are people going to employ to be able to get content that really shouldn't be online. And with Christchurch, we were seeing every 30 seconds, a re-upload of the live stream was making its way onto a platform. And it was first uploaded in Indonesian, and then you'd see it being posted in Korean, and then it would make its way to Spain. That, for me, was one of those events. And unfortunately, there's been a few more over the years. But for me, that was the first one that really made me sit up straight and go, oh, okay, this is really serious now.
Yeah, I remember it was like playing whack-a-mole for lots of platforms, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Really tough. So how does Resolver's capabilities in threat detection apply to gaming then? You know, we've got thousands of people gathering in San Francisco this week for GDC. You've done increasing amounts of work in the gaming space in recent years. What emerging threats have you seen in gaming platforms versus perhaps social media and marketplaces?
Oh, where do I start? I think it's important to start with the acknowledgement of they are interestingly quite similar. So the threats that we see in gaming, in a way, are some of the evergreen risks that we've always been seeing on social media platforms. They are slightly tweaked, as you would expect them to be, to the opportunities that are available in gaming that might not necessarily be anywhere else. But God, we could do many episodes talking about the swatting risks, predatory monetization, increased risk of ransomware and harassment that we're seeing take place online. And it just goes to show really how big the gamification of risk has become in, say, the past 2-3 years, certainly. But it's one of those that it really sits at the intersectionality of a lot of other risk spaces, you know, and it can be really insidious in that regard for a risk that, let's say, hate speech. It's one of the first ones that crop to mind when you ask someone what's some of the more inappropriate things that happen on gaming. People will always talk about hate speech. And it always starts with that friendly banter approach, because a big group of like-minded people have all come together. They all feel really safe. They're all here for the same reason, the same interest. And that's when the banter starts. Because unfortunately, in some of these spaces where these communities are gathering, they have the sense that they are less moderated, so they can get away with saying a little bit more that they know is inappropriate.
Right.
And it goes unchecked. And it goes a little bit further from there. And those are the spaces where we find that banter situation quickly escalate, and then it becomes harassment. And then we see these risks very quickly morph and represent risks to child safety, suicide and self-harm, even terrorism, which for me, talking about gaming, radicalization's got to be up there, I think, as one of the biggest risks. Gaming's a natural conversation starter, which is a really, you know, it's a really positive thing. And like I said, we get people come together around a game that they all like, or a trend within a game that they all like. You know, everyone remembers the Fortnite dances, and that they get a community going in that regard. And I want to be clear, like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. One of the greatest things about social media in the past, 2 decades has been the ability for millions of people worldwide to form those connections, those safe communities, to share experiences, to make friends. And that's a brilliant thing. But when that community gets centered around something that's not so positive, that's where we get into a really dangerous space. That's where, under the veil of sharing things that are like-minded to that community, we get those risks proliferating a lot more than we necessarily would have done.
One thing I wanted to ask about was physically augmented spaces, the kind of augmented reality, virtual reality. Because again, these are new spaces that are emerging where harms differ in terms of their scale, in terms of their definition almost, and how we deal with those. How do you think that changes the nature and severity of some of the harms and also the work that Resolver does?
So these worlds, it's their unique selling point. They blend the digital with the physical. And for me, that raises the stakes of the risk stakes way higher. One of the biggest risks we see with these physically augmented worlds is harassment. And there's this long-held belief by certain users of these spaces that what you say and what you do, they bear no consequence because, hey, well, it's online, right? What's the harm? How can you possibly find me and punish me for this thing that it was only said online? It doesn't count. Augmented harassment, unfortunately, we're seeing it become quite egregious, from virtual stalking, sexual harassment, right through to, unfortunately, sexual assault taking place between users of these spaces. And they're increasingly testing the parameters of what's possible within that world. And unfortunately, for me, biggest piece that I don't think people are aware of is just how much information about yourself you're giving away when you're using these augmented realities. We're seeing gamers increasingly use their home surroundings as part of the game experience. And they're sharing this with who they believe to be other friends, other gamers within these realities. And they're not meaning to, revealing where they live. Where are they at that moment? You know, where do they go to work? Where do they go to school? And this is really opening users up to some of those risks that I mentioned earlier around swatting and other security threats that can be really quite serious and can snowball really quite quickly. You know, back to that idea of it's not real life, you know, what's the harm? This is arguably one of those factors that makes it hard to monitor. It makes it hard to identify because, you know, in these quasi-virtual, quasi-real experiences, where do you draw the line with freedom of expression? Where do you stop the creativity when it stops being creative? Certainly for a lot of these experiences where people are making these modifications to make it their own experience, it really can feel like every man for themselves, or, you know, this is a lawless experience. Like I said, when we were chatting about gaming earlier, there are a lot of similarities between risks that are happening on gaming and risks that are taking place on non-gaming platforms or in other social media spaces. And unfortunately, I think how resolve and monitor all of this, history does unfortunately repeat itself. So whilst bad actors will constantly adapt their behavior, they're constantly going to change the way that they act in the face of the environment that they're in, we are going to see and have seen patterns to the risks that we first saw at the first invention of social media 15, 20 years ago. Users are getting to grips with how to use gaming, certainly how to use these AR experiences, and they're trying to push those boundaries between what is and isn't possible. And that line, you know, it really is blurred. So until we have that distinction of what is clear, I think we're going to have a lot of users who are emboldened to take advantage of it.
Yeah, the multifaceted nature and the constantly evolving nature just really demonstrates the importance of the work that Resolve is doing and will continue to do, hopefully, for another 20 years. So, Carly, thanks so much for joining us today on Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Really appreciate your time and thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.